Since we're reading from John's Gospel today, I thought I'd remind you of a few things that are unique to the way John tells the story. I know some of you already know this, but I know for my own purposes and study, it helped to refresh my memory and to think about them. First, and most notably, John almost always tells things with a symbolic meaning. That becomes clear in the very first chapter where John tells us this story is about light and darkness. For that reason, stories that are told in the other Gospels have a different feel when John tells the same story. For example, Jesus heals a man who is blind. But in the way John tells it, we see the blindness is not just physical. There's a spiritual blindness that needs to be healed as well. In our text for today, death is both physical and spiritual. I am convinced that we are being invited to recognize ourselves in the story of Lazarus. We too have been dead spiritually. Dead, that is, until we hear Jesus calling our name. He calls us by name in this life, not just the next. He's calling us into a life-changing relationship with God. And then he will call us again at the last day. Now, John Wesley, the man who began the movement that we call the United Methodist Church, often taught that God's grace goes before us, even before we know that God is present. That kind of grace shows up in this story when Jesus approaches the tomb and calls our name. But John Wesley also talked about how God's grace is at work in us, perfecting us so that we might become pure and holy, a reflection of the glory of God in our words as well as in our deeds. And that kind of grace shows up in this story when the grave cloths are removed from the man who was dead and is now alive. The reality is that we are often bound up in things that lead to death. Some of them are physical, like disease and sickness. Some are emotional, like resentment and bitterness. Still others are cultural, like racism and poverty. Some of us allow the weight of our grief to bind us up, and others feel the burden of commitments we've made as an anchor on our soul that ties us down. Still others let the past prevent us from living in the present. Each of us, in our own ways, experience some of the death that Lazarus has known. We know that because we've been trapped ourselves. We know that because we find it hard to breathe. We know that because we're not sure that life has purpose or meaning anymore. And if we don't feel that way today, we know we felt that way before. We all know what it means to be wrapped in the burial cloths that surround Lazarus as he comes out of the tomb. We also know that life is more than walking out of the tomb. It requires us to become untangled as well. It's a lot like the female gray whale that had been entangled in a spider web of crab lines and traps. She was weighted down by hundreds of pounds of traps that caused her to struggle just to stay afloat. She also had hundreds of yards of line rope wrapped around her body, her tail, her torso. A line was tugging in her mouth. There's a fisherman who spotted her just east of the Farallon Islands. This is just outside the Golden Gate Bridge. He radioed for help. Within a few hours, a rescue team arrived and determined that she was so badly entangled that the only way they could get her out was to send divers into the water, which was extremely dangerous. It's just a slight tug of her tail and they would be gone. They worked for hours with curved knives and eventually freed her. When she was finally set free, the divers say she swam in what seemed like joyous circles, and then she returned to each of the divers in the water, touched them and slightly nudged them as if to say thank you. Some said it was the most incredibly beautiful experience of their lives. The man who cut the line out of her mouth said her eyes were watching him the whole time, And he said he'll never be the same. And while he may never be the same, I can only surmise that the whale won't be either. Which leads me to wonder, who unbinds us when we're wrapped in the death cloths of grief and bitterness and rejection? Jesus calls us from the spiritual tombs of our lives, but who sets us free? Sometimes I find it's my family that frees me from the decay of death. It's the unconditional love that nurtures me out of the pain. Sometimes I hear the voices of teachers and counselors from school. They help me hear the voice of reason that is helping me see the truth of my circumstances. And other times it has been the prayers of the church that have freed me. They've freed me from the burdens of sin, both my sin and the sin of others, as I move into a life of freedom. Wherever they have come from, though, others have been there to unbind me. Like Lazarus, I find myself breathing freely again once I'm freed. I experience the freedom of making choices now that I'm unbound. I find purpose and meaning in my day-to-day life. Now, there have also been times when I realize God is asking me to be the one to unbind the Lazarus in our midst. I'm being asked to offer unconditional love. I'm asked to express the voice of truth. I'm asked to offer prayer. I'm asked to share the promise of forgiveness. I confess, though, there are times when I refuse to do so. I find the death wraps to be so disgusting that I turn away. I make excuses and keep Lazarus under wraps. And I know I'm not alone in this. I know you too have had your opportunities to set someone free. And like me, regrettably, you have also refused to do so on occasion. In fact, I asked that question on Facebook this week. Had lots of people respond. I asked them if there were reasons that we might not set someone free if we had the power to do so. Now, the answers varied. I would expect that. Some are too exhausted to help. Others want to see evidence that the person deserves to be set free. Still others are so wrapped up in their own death cloths that they can't get out to help someone else. God's desire is for all of us to be free. I believe Jesus calls us just as clearly as he calls Lazarus. And I believe the role of the church is to offer unbounded love so that life beyond the tomb can become a reality in all of our lives. I have a video I'd like to share that helps offer an example of how things in life can bind us up. How we cannot experience true life until we are unbound. It's a little longer than what I usually share on a Sunday morning, but I think it's worth the wait. Let's watch. Oops. Go back to it. Just click on the black.
Je m'appelle Francine.
My name is Francine Christopher.
Je suis née le
I was
18
born on
août
August 18, 1933.
1933
was the year when
c'est
Hitler took
l'année où
power.
Hitler prend le pouvoir. Voilà,
Look,
c'est mon
this is my
étoile.
star.
Je la porte
I had to wear it
sur
on
la
my chest,
poitrine,
of course,
bien entendu, comme tous les juifs.
like all Jews.
C'est gros, n'est-ce pas?
It's big, isn't it?
Surtout sur
Especially
une
for a
poitrine
child.
d'enfant, puisque j'ai 8 ans en ce
That was when I
moment-là.
was 8 years old.
Il s'est passé dans
When I
mon
was
camp
in
de
Bergen-Belsen
Bergen-Belsen
camp,
quelque chose de tout
an
à fait
amazing thing happened.
extraordinaire. Je rappelle
Let me
que
remind
nous
you,
étions des enfants de
As the
prisonniers de
children
guerre
of
et à ce
prisoners of
titre
war,
privilégiés.
we were privileged.
Donc nous avions
We
eu
were
le
permitted
droit
to bring
d'emporter
something from
de
France.
France un petit sac
little bag with
avec
2 or 3
deux, trois
small
petites
items.
choses. Une femme un
One
petit bout
woman
de
brought
chocolat,
chocolate,
une femme un petit
another
morceau
some
de sucre,
sugar,
une femme
a third
petite
a handful
poignée
of
de
rice.
riz. Maman avait emporté
My mom
deux
packed
petits
2 little
morceaux de
pieces of
chocolat.
chocolate.
Elle me disait,
So
on
she
garde
said to
ça
me,
pour le jour où
we'll
je
keep
te
this for a
verrai
day when
vraiment
I see
complètement
you've collapsed completely and really need help.
fichu. Je te donnerai ce
I'll give
chocolat,
you this
il
chocolate
t'aidera
and you'll feel
peut-être
better.
à remonter. Or, il y avait
One
parmi
of the
nous une
women
femme qui avait
imprisoned
été
with us
déportée alors qu'elle était
was pregnant.
enceinte. Ça ne se voyait
couldn't
pas,
tell,
évidemment,
she
elle
was so
était si
skinny.
maigre. Mais n'empêche que
But the day
le
came
jour
when
de
she went into
l'accouchement est
labor.
arrivé, et elle est partie
She
au
went
refuge
to the camp
accompagnée de ma
hospital
mère, qui était notre chef
with
de
my mom,
baraque.
the barracks chief.
Et avant de partir,
Before
ma
they
mère me
left,
dit,
my mom said,
tu te souviens que je
remember
garde
that
un morceau
chocolate
de
I was
chocolat?
saving for you?
Oui, maman.
Yes, Mama.
Comment te
How do you
sens-tu?
feel?
Bien, maman, ça
Fine,
peut
Mama.
aller.
I'll be okay.
Alors, si tu
Well, then, if it's all right
me
with
le
you,
permets, ce morceau de
I'd
chocolat,
like
je
to bring your chocolate
l'apporterai
to this lady,
à notre
our
amie
friend
Hélène,
Aileen.
parce qu'un
Giving birth
accouchement
there
ici,
will be hard.
elle va peut-être
She may
mourir.
die.
Et si je lui donne
I'll
le
give her the
chocolat,
chocolate.
ça l'aidera
It may help
peut-être.
her.
Oui, maman,
Yes, Mama. Go
tu le
ahead.
prends. Hélène a accouché,
And then
elle a
gave
accouché
birth
d'un
to the
bébé,
baby,
toute petite chose
teeny little
malingre.
feeble thing.
Elle a mangé le
She
chocolat,
ate the chocolate.
elle n'est pas
She did not
morte.
die.
Et elle est revenue
She
dans
came
la
back to the
baraque.
barracks.
Le bébé
The
n'a
baby
jamais
never
pleuré,
cried.
jamais,
Never.
pas même
He
jamais.
didn't even wail.
Au bout de 6 mois,
6 months later, the
la
camp was liberated.
libération est arrivée. On a
They
défait tous
unwrapped
ces
the baby's
chiffons.
rags,
Le
and
bébé
the baby
a
screamed.
crié. C'était là
That was when he was born.
sa naissance. Nous l'avons
We took him
ramené
back
en
to France.
France. Tout petit truc de
Puny
6
little
mois,
thing for 6 months.
minuscule. Il y a
A
quelques
few years
années,
ago,
ma fille
my
me
daughter
dit,
asked me, Mama,
Maman, si vous aviez eu
if
des
you deportees had
psychologues
had psychologists
ou des
or a
psychiatres à
psychiatrist
votre
when you
retour,
returned,
ça se serait mieux
maybe
passé
it would have
pour
been
vous.
easier for you.
Je dis sûrement,
I replied,
mais
undoubtedly,
il n'y en avait
but
pas.
we didn't have them.
Plus personne n'y a
No one
pensé,
thought
même
of
s'il y en
mental
avait
illness.
eu. Mais tu me donnes une
But you
bonne
have
idée.
you gave me a good
On va
idea.
faire une
We'll have a
conférence
lecture on
là-dessus.
that topic,
Et j'ai organisé
I
une
organized a lecture
conférence sur
on the
le
theme,
thème. Et s'il y avait
if the
eu des
survivors
psys en
of concentration
1945
camps
à notre
had had
retour des
counseling
camps, comment est-ce que ça se
in
serait passé?
1945, what would have happened?
J'ai eu beaucoup de monde,
The lecture drew a crowd,
des anciens,
elderly
des survivants,
survivors,
des curieux, et
historians
puis
and many
beaucoup de
psychologists,
psychologues, psychiatres,
psychiatrists,
psychothérapeutes, tout ce qu'on avait.
psychotherapists.
Très intéressant.
Very interesting.
Chacun avait son idée,
Many
c'était
ideas
très bien.
emerged. It was excellent.
Et puis il y a une femme
Then
qui
a
est
woman
arrivée
took the podium and
et qui a
said,
dit, moi,
I
j'habite
live in Marseille.
Marseille, je suis
when
médecin psychiatre,
where I'm a psychiatrist,
et avant
before I
de vous
deliver my
faire
talk,
ma communication, j'ai quelque chose
I
à
have something
donner
for
à
Francine.
Francine Christophe, c'est-à-dire à
in
moi.
other words, me.
Elle fouille dans sa
She
poche,
reached into her pocket
elle sort un
and
morceau
pulled out
de
a piece of
chocolat,
chocolate.
elle me le
She gave it to
donne
me,
et elle me
and
dit,
she said,
je suis
I'm the
le
baby.
bébé.
God's desire is for us to be set free. God's desire is for all people to be set free. Set free from the bonds of death and grief. Set free from the bondage of bitterness and animosity. Set free from the evils of racism and poverty. Set free from the mistakes of our past and our anxieties about the future. But it can only happen if two things take place. We must step forward when Jesus calls our name.